Voices have a strong meaning. They share what the eyes cannot see. Voices echo, encourage, empower, and support.
Welcome to the Listening to One Another to Grow Strong podcast series.
We are inviting you to embark with us on a journey in the work and reflection of the Listening to One Another to Grow Strong program, or LTOA for short.
LTOA is a strength-based, community-driven, and culturally adapted program for Indigenous families and youth. The program is rooted in the principle that family well-being is a cornerstone of individual and community wellness.
The program originates out of a collaboration between First Nations communities in British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and research teams based out of McGill University.
In the delivery and research of LTOA, we are following the different stages of the implementation cycle to learn more about what works, how it works, and how it works for.
This podcast series is based on exchanges with partners of the LTOA program and will help us learn more about the implementation cycle.
We hope to foster community engagement and connection by listening to each other's stories, passions, and work around the LTOA program.
We believe this podcast can help us gain insight on how the program works on the ground, and it will allow us to learn from the different individuals involved in the program to grow stronger and inspire people around us.
We are your hosts, Nicole,
Tristan,
and Caroline.
Welcome to the third episode of the Listening to One Another podcast series. My name is Caroline Beck. I'll be your narrator and guide today. Come with me while we follow a discussion amongst the LTOA core research and implementation team. As a newest member of the LTOA team, I had the privilege of interviewing my colleagues and talk about different aspects of programming in the LTOA project during the COVID-19 pandemic. We had quite a long conversation, so we decided to divide the episode in two parts. The first part focused on implementation during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the second part, that you're listening to right now, presents reflection on research, ethics, and positionality. I am delighted to welcome back Dr. Lawrence Kirmayer, a James McGill professor and director of the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill University. Dr. Kirmayer is a principal investigator of the LTOA project. Dr. Kirmayer presents here the state of the research in the LTOA project and offers some reflection about programming.
Well, I mean, it's important to say that the LTOA program now is in a different stage of research than it was when it began, when we had research grants specifically to work on the implementation process. We're now really in a stage where what we're doing is less research than sort of quality assurance and program development. So we're really just trying to keep improving the program, to keep learning from each other, what works, what doesn't work. I mean, that's the spirit of research always anyway, but we have more flexibility in some sense about what we're doing in terms of understanding the process and trying to use our knowledge, use our own reflection on what we're doing to improve the way that we're doing things. So that's the overarching. I just mentioned that first of all, because that's sort of the overall goal here now is what can we learn to improve what we're doing? What can we learn to make it more available to people? What are some of the barriers that we have to find ways around? What are some of the ingredients that really make things go well? That's really what we're trying to do as a community. It's not really about me as a coordinator or director of certain things. It's not about the students or the other people working on the project. It's really about the whole group of us, the whole community of people involved across the country and in Indigenous communities and so on, thinking through what works and what could be better. So that's kind of where we're coming from. How we can do that now, as I say, I mean, we have these methods of communication where we can talk to each other, where we can have conversations and encourage each other. We've often found in work in Indigenous communities, there's a very strong recognition of the importance that communities have ownership and control over their own knowledge, over their own approaches, that that research is not first and foremost for other people. It's first and foremost for the community. If it can help other people, great. I think we all live in a world where we're trying to help each other, so we want that to happen. But first of all, it has to make sense to the people who are directly involved. And many communities have notions of who holds certain kinds of knowledge. Elders hold certain kinds of knowledge about traditions, about history, and so on. People of different ages have knowledge about their own experience, and people in different segments of the community. And we want to be able to share that in ways that are respectful of who's appropriate to hold that knowledge and who's appropriate to share that with, but also recognizing that the process of explaining and talking together about things can sometimes deepen people's own understanding. So in most of the work we've done over the years with Indigenous communities, we've often tried to partner people, someone who is inside the community, who in a sense has very personal, very direct knowledge of how things work and what's going on, and someone from outside the community who may or may not be Indigenous, it depends who's involved in a particular project, but who can ask certain questions that are maybe a little bit naive, a little bit innocent, a little bit like a beginner, like, hey, what's that about? Tell me about that. And that kind of question, which people inside the community might not ask because it's obvious to them, becomes an important way for people to begin clarify what's going on, and what's special about how things are being done and what can be learned about it. So that partnership of people who have inside knowledge, as it were, who know from their everyday life kind of how things work, or but may not always even know what they know because they sort of take it for granted. They just use it in their everyday life. It's not something they think of as knowledge that they could share with someone. But when someone comes along and says, oh, how come you do it? How come you do that here? Or what do you do over there? Those questions become interesting to both people and become the basis of a kind of conversation in which each of them learns something from the other in talking about it. And it's especially interesting, comes back to what we were talking about earlier about cross-community links. When it's an Indigenous person from another place who's part of the research and they say, oh, we do it a bit differently over there, that becomes interesting to both people, and it helps them to understand what is similar, even though it might be done differently, what's similar and what's different. And it's something we found in the program, that there's certain values, things like respect, things like understanding one's own roots and one's own tradition, things like the importance of family and connection and so on, that are probably universal in the sense that every human being everywhere understands these things, understands the value of these things. But the actual shape that they take, the actual way that people live them out differs in different places. And people can really learn from that and enjoy that and enrich their own understanding. So even when people sometimes feel like, well, we already know this, it's not research. We already know what this is. We don't need to make it a thing. Having that conversation, the inside outside sort of conversation of getting to know each other, really sometimes leads people to reflect in different ways and become aware really of the richness of what they have and of ways in which they could strengthen it further, of ways in which they could use it creatively. So that's kind of the broad perspective that we try to use and that we approach in terms of everyone who's involved. That it's research in the end is about it comes from research. So you're searching again, you're looking again, you're trying to see if you can see something a little bit new in what's going on. To do that, you need to be exposed to things that are different or things that are novel, or ask a new question in some ways. And that helps you see a new facet of things that are going on. So that's the spirit of it. And and I think that also clarifies why everybody who gets involved, since we all have different backgrounds, we all have different experiences, everybody who gets involved has something to contribute, simply because they're going to offer a new perspective. They're going to see things from a little bit different point of view, and that's going to raise interesting questions for everybody to think about and talk about.
Onto the team now. We started off discussing a recent presentation Dr. Nicole de Souza did at the Réseau québécois sur le suicide, les troubles de l'humeur et les troubles associés. This led us to talk about research in the LTOA program, about relational ethics, positionality, and the importance of reflecting on all of this, especially when working with Indigenous community partners during the COVID-19 pandemic.
so at the meeting, I represented our team in talking about our recent work on cultural safety. And this work stemmed out of a meeting we had in 2019, where our partners, our community partners, came together in Winnipeg to discuss the importance of instilling a culturally safe space, especially in implementation research and in program implementation. So, we've heard a lot about this term cultural safety, and it's used a lot in work within Indigenous communities and in communities in general. And so when we talk about cultural safety, it can take on very distinct elements of what that could look like. Cultural safety in practice, in clinical practice, in community practice, and then cultural safety in research. And so for us, we were trying to map out, what does cultural safety in research look like for the program, and what are tenets of it that we must take into account before we even can engage in programming and research. So the paper was a reflection of that meeting. We spoke about the importance of certain characteristics of forming relationships that allow trust to be built, authenticity, vulnerability, being open about our intentions. These are some precursors that allow the research relationship to be built. We also spoke about the importance of space itself, where you do research actually changes what you find in terms of knowledge. And so you really need to think about, okay, well, if the program is going to be implemented in a community, what are some safe spaces in which people can come together, share a meal, and engage in the programming? And then we spoke about culture as an element in which people have different relationships too. And so trying to move away from this idea of a pan-Indigenous way of doing things. Communities get to decide what approaches they want to use within their communities in working. And so these are all elements that are very important to consider, especially in implementation research. And this work has come together over multiple different conversations and meetings over the years. And we continue to develop a framework for thinking through this. So especially now, one of the most important elements is, as things have moved online, and even some of our research activities have moved online, we're no longer in communities doing circles, talking circles or focus groups. A lot of our activities are on Zoom or on the phone, interviews and focus groups. What does cultural safety look like in a digital space? And these are some of the questions our team are currently working through and understanding. Like, how do we carve out a culturally safe space in doing this work now online? So this is, basically the direction of our current research, trying to map out the tenets of this.
It definitely makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much for sharing all of this. And actually, what does it look like to talk about cultural safety online during meetings and presenting the work that has been done within LTOA and with the work alongside LTOA community partners? And how does it, what does it look like to present this work to other researchers and to other practitioners in Indigenous mental health?
What does it look like to present this work?
Mm-hmm.
I think for us, at least as the central team, and I mean, we have been working in partnership with communities, but one of the biggest significant factors is that our team is non-Indigenous. And so what does it mean to come and bring different perspectives and lenses of knowledge together in having an understanding of what this work looks like on the ground, but also translates to for others who want to engage with it? A lot of the times when we're talking about community mental health in Indigenous contexts, it cannot be taken for granted that there are specific people engaged in this work. It involves multidisciplinary teams. It involves people coming together from different cultural backgrounds, and it requires an immense amount of strength, patience, perseverance to engage in. It's not easy work to engage in, because it also involves you coming into understanding and engaging in a process of going through your own personal decolonization. And I think in this program, especially as the central team of non-Indigenous allies in this work, we have had to confront a lot of ways in which we do this work in terms of our processes. So if I am going to a conference and I'm presenting work of the LTOA program, what am I taking with me? Whose voices am I representing? How am I representing these voices? And these are all elements that we have to work through in making sure the work is represented to its best abilities, because while our partners are very involved in co-producing knowledge in this program, not everyone is available to disseminate this knowledge to different avenues. And so it takes a group reflexive process. And, our weekly team meetings are a space in which we come together and reflect on that. And that's been one of the strengths of this program, that even as we have moved and shifted online, we continue to hold a meeting space weekly. And I think that is one of the biggest components of this sort of participatory, community engaged work, to have a group reflexive process.
This conversation on positionality was later reflected upon when we discussed training research assistants and continuing a relationship amongst the team members despite physical distancing.
I guess I can take a stab at this question. Okay, so basically, how do we maintain this? Well, before COVID, we had an office, mind you, a windowless office.
A windowless office.
that we would meet in. And I would be able to see, the research assistants such as Tristan, Michaela, and Mia, who was a former RA in the program, on a daily basis. And that really helped foster connection in our team, because we would physically be together. We would take lunches together, take walks together, and see each other. I think in shifting to an online platform, we've tried to maintain the structure of the weekly meetings as a way of connecting. But I think we've also tried to I don't know, allow new modes of working together to emerge. So for example, within the research of this team, there are many, like Michaela and Tristan, you guys can speak for yourselves, but you're now master's students working on your own projects tied to the program or not. And so how do we, and you too, Kehoe, as a doctoral student in the program, just fostering like a writing space. So we have writing meetings weekly that we meet online, and we tend not to talk. We try hard not to talk.
Stop looking at me. I know I'm chatty. Okay.
There's some of us who are chattier than others, but we really try and, foster relationships, not just within the space of the research, because I think it's really hard to do this kind of work and only coming to the table with a set agenda at certain times, because this work is essentially very, very personal, very relational, very organic. And so a lot of the aspects of how we learned about each other through lunchtime conversations, through walks to get coffee, need to emerge in different ways. And so one of the spaces is, a research space. And yeah, I think that's my reflection on research. Michelle, I don't know if you have a reflection on anything else.
Well, I have always sort of been working remotely. sort of away from the central team in Montreal. So, that has always been a bit of a challenge. But I think, Nicole, as you had mentioned, trying to maintain, some structure and to have that open space where we can, connect about work, but also taking some time to, connect on like, a more interpersonal aspect where, we start our meetings with just like an open time to chat, to, sort of, connect and how's the week going, what's going on, what are some successes, and also I think it's, important to during this time to, yes, have structure, but, also to know when you can be flexible and, when you can sort of shift things around and pivot to ensure that people's mental health is strong, that people are feeling well, that you can have a space that people can be transparent, that they can share, that they may be going through a difficult time. I think all of our mental wellness has been tested over this time. So having, a team that is there to support, and if you're comfortable to open up to say, hey, I need more time, or, I need, a bit of space, I think we've done a pretty good job at maintaining that and being, I guess that balance of structure and flexibility, I think, is really important. And I think that, I think that carries over, that attitude, that mindset, carries over to how we approach working with community partners. During this time of COVID, everything, like at the start, everything sort of just came to a screeching halt, right? We didn't know what was happening. We didn't know how long we would be in this. Programs on the ground were essentially paused, were shut down. For those listeners who don't know what LTOA is about, it's about creating a space where people are coming together to share and learn and listen. And it's very personal. And when I say personal, it's very much about bringing people together, bringing elders, bringing youth, bringing adults and caregivers together. So we couldn't do that. Community partners couldn't do that, right? We couldn't safely bring people together to have this space for LTOA. So we've had to really maintain that mindset of being flexible during this time, because communities were having to pivot on a very tight turn to ensure that the safety of their community members were at the top, were at the forefront, ensuring people had access to good, nutritious food, ensuring that there was healthcare available, all of these things. So we saw a lot of our community partners adapt their roles within their community organizations. If they were a regional coordinator for LTOA and were also, mental health care worker, like they had to ramp up that aspect of their mental health work, because that's what communities were needing at the time. So there was very much that reflexivity on the ground as well. And we had to roll with that. We had to, which we have to, that's just part of this, of community-based work, is meeting people where they're at. So we very much had to do that. And we're quite honestly happy to do that. And I think that I think, we're trying to, maintain this community of practice throughout this time to ensure that there is a space for people to share, how can the LTOA program assist during this time? And, we've seen, we've been able to create or still develop some toolkits that can hopefully assist during this time of social distancing or physical distancing, I should say, where, youth and families can still access some of the valuable tools found within the LTOA program, but in a different way. So we've really tried to, adapt as best as we can. But to be honest, we're still learning. Every day we're learning something new, how to do something better, how to reflect on maybe some of our past practices. So every day is a learning opportunity. So,
And I was wondering, really, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, so what does research really look like without face-to-face direct interactions? And I think Tristan, you've been as the main person doing research here, so if you wanted to contribute to this. So you've been a research assistant for over 3 years in the program now, and you're actually, in addition to being a research assistant, you're also doing your master's thesis, working through the creation of an online activity for family and youth. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk to us a bit more about this.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily an online activity, but it's a remote activity. So when we're doing the call that Michelle was referring to before, like with all the partners from LTOA and talking to everybody from across Canada, we were kind of discussing new ways to kind of adapt LTOA to the times. There was a lot of energy behind getting things moving, and of course, COVID stopped all of that. So one thing first we spoke about was trying to do something over Zoom and having families meet over Zoom and having facilitator and elder over Zoom and maybe getting something working like that. But the barrier that came up first was lack of internet that is sustainable for a Zoom call. Zoom is a very demanding resource. So people are saying, they do use Zoom calls for some meetings, but oftentimes participants get cut out. And if you have, tens of families on there, it's going to be very hard to organize. Like everyone's getting cut out, everyone's coming back in, lots of interruptions like that. It's not going to flow organically. And there's also the issue of, does everyone have the right technology for it? Because then they're going to have to budget that in if they don't, and, figuring that out as well. So the idea was not necessarily to use something that requires technology, but then can be supplemented by it. So we thought of, there's an activity within the program called the Tree of Life activity, which basically encompasses all the teachings from LTOA. And Michelle, you can jump in if I miss something here. But it encompasses basically all the teaching from LTOA, and they basically see everything that comes out of it in a tree. So it's like from the roots, you have stuff like culture, trunk, it's your strengths. And then from that, you branch out to your individual skill sets and gifts. And it's supposed to like basically you see yourself grow as over the course of the program as you grow your tree. And we thought, we could expand this activity. I think it was Michelle and Michaela who thought about this. Like we could also expand this activity to include more elements from the LTOA programming. Like it doesn't just have to be a basic tree. Like we can include a lot of the exercises we had originally. So a lot of work was done then to kind of look on what exists. And I've been involved as well as working with Dr. Kirmayer to look at what other programs have done and kind of looking to update materials as well, because it is new times. Cyberbullying is very different right now. The way we talk about drugs and refusal skills is very different right now. So, updating some materials like that, and then talking to community partners about what they think of the materials, getting some feedback as well, and then kind of just seeing how it goes. Of course, it's not as intensive as making a whole new program. A lot of the stuff comes from LTOA. A lot of it is just kind of copy paste because a lot of things do translate well. It's just adapting some words and some activities to really make it fit. And yeah, it's just kind of growing it that way and talking to community partners about how they can envision this being developed and being implemented in the communities and what elements would be culturally adapted as well.
That's very cool. This is a very exciting project.
I forgot to mention actually, and the idea of it being supplemented by online resources is that someone can scan a QR code and be taken to a website if they still want to learn more about something, or they could talk on Zoom or whatever with a facilitator if technology permits, and kind of get stuff that way. If we wanted, we kind of talking about making videos of some of the activities just so people can get an idea of how they work. But, that's something that would have to be created in the future. That's not the top priority right now, but it could also then help supplement what is being done with the toolkit.
Tristan later talks about conducting his master's research during the pandemic.
Yeah, so as you know, we normally would conduct research by going into communities, normally for other reasons as well, but then like conducting research on the side. And a lot of that helps to build partnerships as well, because when you're in person, you could joke around, make people feel more comfortable, laugh a bit, and be a little more silly. Not everything's recorded during the in-betweens, so it's not, you don't have to be as professional, so to speak, or as stern. But the difficulty with conducting research over Zoom is that a lot of that is taken away. You're basically just going in for that 1 hour to talk and then leave. It's a lot more awkwardness around it too. We can't just put a consent form in front of someone and say, okay, do you have any questions? Sign it, let's go. You have to go through a process of oral consent, which can be a little awkward to conduct, reading the statement of content and making sure everyone understands, and getting electronic consent as well. There's a lot more steps to that. And yeah, the smaller interactions are also gone. There's more difficulty of knowing when someone's not done talking, like when you're interrupting them, talking over them. But there are some easier things as well, like some people are easier to reach, like just for an hour to get in contact with, so that's been good. And Zoom does bring some easier to record features. I know in the past, Nicole can speak to this as well, we've had recording machines that didn't record. And that's like such a pain to go through like a 5-hour conversation just not to record. So the fact that the actual device Zoom is recording stuff is a big help. But when it comes to building partnerships, that's been a big barrier because, when you go into a community, you meet them for a few days, you talk to them, you develop a safe space that way. I've been lucky enough to be in this program for a few years. I could talk to people I already had contact with. So someone like Erin in BC or Katie and Caitlin in Nova Scotia. But just as an example, it's like you've been talking to them, and it's easier to do research when you know the person and you have this trusting relationship. But then when you're talking to new people, it could also be kind of awkward. Like they don't know you, they don't know what you're about. It's harder for them to just pick up the phone and answer you. And then other things like Michelle said earlier, people are also very busy right now. So the community worker had a mental health part of their agenda. Now that's been taken on most of their agenda. It's harder to find time to talk. So those are some of the things. And we've also had to redo our whole ethics protocol to really fit this in. So of course, talking over in person, it's a pretty easy procedure to follow. But then when you're talking over Zoom, you have to reapply for ethics. That was like another little month and a bit to hear back, and make it over Zoom, a premium version of Zoom, to make sure everything is secure, all the networks are secure, and then going with the hospital says about oral consent and everything.
And I think continuing to build a relationship is really paramount if we want to continue doing research in this space. Dr. Kirmayer offers us some insight about doing research online and the difficulty in creating safe spaces.
Well, when you're actually in a place, you have a very strong sense of the place. The danger with Zoom is what you have is a very strong sense of looking at a screen, looking at a rectangle on a screen, and it's like looking at TV or a movie or something, and you've just got this, it looks like there's a little bit of context, like I'm talking to you now and I can see a chair behind you and I can see your little platform for your cat behind you, and I can see a balcony out the window or whatever, but I don't really have a strong sense of your place. And the more different a place is, I can imagine somebody who's living in a place a little bit like mine, I can sort of imagine the details, but if I'm talking to somebody who's living in a very different place, they're living in the mountains or living by the water or whatever, I may not have a strong sense of what that's like. So that's one challenge, I think. And maybe what it speaks to, we haven't done very much of this, but I think people should carry around their cameras, and we should go for walks together. So if we're talking to somebody in some other place, they should just walk along and show us things and tell us about them. And maybe we would have a sense of them in the process, because people are not just what's inside them. They're also what are they in connection with? What are they in dialogue with in the world around them, in the environment? And that's definitely very important, from Indigenous perspectives, that people have a strong sense of that. Anybody who lives, in a rural area close to the land, or just has a value system that makes that, in important and in the foreground in their thinking, that sense of place is going to be very important. So you do get a strange sense of place on Zoom. The far away seems near, and the near seems far away, and it's all very different. And I think that's a new thing for human beings. It has an upside and a downside. Again, the upside is we can connect quickly with anybody anywhere to some degree. But the downside is we don't get a strong sense of place. And I think place is very important for human beings in our experience. So I see that as a challenge, and the risk is, again, we think of the person just in terms of the conversation, just in terms of the face of the person we're looking at. Having said that, some of my work in the past has been with people coming into the clinic to talk to me. So then I see them just in my place, in my context. So it's already a small improvement to be talking to somebody who's sitting at home and talking. So I don't want to paint it all, it's not all just a negative thing. We're already getting a little bit of a sense, okay, you're coming from you're sitting in a different place, you're coming from a different place. So I think we have to be open to exploring that a little bit with people. It's interesting sometimes with Zoom that people will use the green screen effect to put a fake background around them. And I think that exaggerates the problem we're just talking about, because then there's no sense. Now they look like they're standing on the top of a mountain, or they've got outer space behind them, or some other weird background that these things allow you put. And those are fun. And I guess you're seeing the person's choices, their preferences, their playful, their aesthetic preferences when they choose a particular background. But what you're not seeing is the actual physical environment that they're inhabiting that is a big part of who they are and how they're living, and how they think, because we think with the objects and the people and the environment around us. It's part of our imagination, part of our experience, and so on. So I think that's something we have to be a little more systematic about, and maybe be deliberate about it, maybe talk about it, maybe ask people to tell us about it. And you can move around if you're talking on a video phone or on a computer or whatever. You can move the camera around a little bit and show people, and maybe we should be doing more of that. Well, people might also not, there's all this joking about what's just off screen. People don't want to show you, oh, I've got a stack of boxes next to me, or all the trash I haven't thrown out, or or whatever. I'm wearing my pajamas instead of my regular clothes. So there is all that kind of stuff going on that I think they made on some of the comedy programs on TV. They've made some jokes about that kind of stuff. So.
Following the same theme Dr. Kirmayer laid out, the team reflected on trust and online research.
And I guess another thing, part of it is when you build relationships and make a trusting space, it's reading body language is a big part of that. Knowing when other people are comfortable. Just seeing someone's face isn't always enough. Are they fidgeting? Are they not comfortable in their seat? Do we need to take a break? That is also lost.
And if I were to add one thing about this idea of trust, especially how it comes into community-based participatory research, is that we can't take for granted that trust always exists. That even if we do have trust at the beginning of partnerships, because LTOA has been built over decades of partnerships, and we all have entered into this fold with relationships already in place that we have been folded into. But if we take for granted that because of this structure, trust is omnipresent, it wouldn't allow us to do the work we're doing, because I think trust is something active. You have to constantly work towards it, to upkeep it, to uphold it. And in working in this program, we've seen how that comes into play. It's been a completely different landscape for online work. How do you build trust that may have existed before, but now you're trying to work towards maintaining it when you don't get to see each other, when you don't get to share personal conversations, when a lot of the time, because people are completely inundated in this online world, and as much as we would love to sit on Zoom and talk about how is life going, a lot of times they're like, we have 20 minutes. How can we, what can we do on either side? Because we have so many of these calls now back to back. How do you foster these relationships? And it's slow. It requires stepping out of your comfort zone. It requires making yourself more vulnerable, to ensure that you are giving your authentic self to this work. And yeah, I think it's a hard aspect to navigate, especially in an online research world now.
I was going to add something also about we can't sit here and just assume that everybody has internet access. We can't just okay, the things shut down, everyone switched to online and it's going to work. That doesn't make sense for many of the communities that we work with. Some people maybe only have access if they go to a specific area of town, or it can be very dependent on location and where these communities are. And I think why we've needed, from all levels, people to understand and be flexible to that, and from ourselves, is because not every context, not every community is in the same place. And just, I think a lot of people were like, okay, yeah, school switch over, work just switch to Zoom. We can all sit here and it'll be fine. That can be really unreasonable for a lot of the people that we work with. And so how do we create that trust? How do we create this space when we can't maybe even see each other? Is definitely a question and something that we talk about almost every week. And it's something that we are always piecing together and thinking through, and even asking, LTOA partners what we could do as well, what would make things easier.
To conclude this episode, I asked Dr. Kirmayer what the future holds for the LTOA program.
As you know, we have two other versions of the program that we've been working on that are different stages of development. One is a short version that's oriented toward the school classroom. So it's just some components of LTOA that can be done in a classroom. And that is interesting because hopefully it will expose more people to the idea of the program and so on, but also because there are many kinds of classrooms. There are classrooms within Indigenous communities where everybody's from the same community. But some of our partners are in urban settings where there may be classrooms that have mixture of people from different First Nations or non-Indigenous students in the same classroom. And I think it's a very interesting idea to try to find some version of this program that will work in that setting. So each person can be connecting to their own background to some degree, but also learning a bit about each other's backgrounds, because that's the larger world that we're living in. That's the larger world that young people are going to be living in and have to, adapt to. And I think that the idea that you can strike a balance between strengthening your own sense of where you come from and also, being interested and curious and learning about all the diverse different groups in the world is a very positive thing for the world, for our society, for living together and so on. So, we're at a certain moment right now when there's been a growing awareness of the hardships associated with racism and discrimination, in our societies. And part of fixing that is really changing the larger society, changing the attitudes of other people. So actually, this kind of work where you imagine talking about some of the issues that LTOA looks at, not just within an Indigenous community, but within the larger society, could have a very beneficial effect in the long run. So I find that encouraging and important, that kind of work. And the other thing that we're doing, which is kind of an adaptation of LTOA, given that we can't be there to, people can't necessarily be there physically to do the program as a big group, is to make a self-guided version of the program that a young person and or their family can work on together in their home in a certain way. And I think that's the long-term goal for L2A, is to create all kinds of materials like this, to put them out there, to make them easily available to people so that people can use them as they need, that they can further develop them or they can apply them as they are. We hope that there'll be multiple versions in the end that were adapted by different communities. So a new First Nations community or a new person coming to this stuff could find something close to what they need, and maybe it won't need much adaptation, or they'll see how to adapt it because they'll see different examples. So that's kind of the legacy we'd like to leave, so that the program in a sense stands on its own, or it's there as tools, as resources, as inspiration for people who want to do something in the area of this kind of promoting health and well-being.
This is the end of this two-part episode with the LTOA team. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We would love to hear from our listeners. What does cultural safety look like in your organization? How do you conduct research online? I would like to shout out to Jeff Wells, who composed the music of the podcast especially for us. and I would also love to thank the LTOA team for their support in this endeavor. Join us in this journey and stay tuned for new episodes soon. Don't forget to keep up to date with LTOA news by checking out our website www.mcgill.ca/mhp and following us on Facebook or Instagram. And lastly, don't forget to follow, like and share this third episode. See you soon!